Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Improving ICS OT Visibility and Threat Detection with the Dragos platform, sponsored by Dragos. My name is Jessica Gallus of SANS, and today's featured speakers are Ben Miller, VP, Professional Service and RD, and John Lavender, CTO and co-founder at Dragos, who will be moderating today's webcast. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the control panel at any time. Please note that a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be made available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to turn the webcast over to John.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. Myself and Ben are going to walk through, let me transition here. Myself and Ben are going to walk through a demo. We're going to talk a bit about a scenario based around a fictitious town called Cyberville. We're also going to kind of dive into what the current and recent landscape looks like in ICS, touch base on the end of year report that Dragos put out last year, as well as SANS. And then talk a bit about what ICS visibility or what ICS asset visibility and threat detection, some different strategies around that, and kind of provide a demo or look into the Dragos platform as we talk through that. And then at the end, if we have some time, we'll do some questions and answers as well. So if you have questions that come up during this, feel free to drop them in the Q&A section for Zoom. A little bit of background about myself. I'm one of the co-founders at Dragos. I've got kind of a broad experience across a bunch of different areas. So I spent about a decade at the National Security Agency, working in strategy, doing various cybersecurity operations, doing research and development as well. And I have a background in doing analysis. At Dragos, I've been heavily involved on the engineering and product side of the house. Let's see, with that, I will turn it over to Ben.
Awesome. Thanks, John. Hey, everyone. Good to see everyone virtually, at least. I recognize some of the names in the attendees list. It's good to be kind of out there, even if we can't attend conferences. My name is Ben Miller. I'm the Vice President of Professional Services in the R&D. My background in general has been in the electric space. So I was an asset owner for a number of years, and then after that I moved over to NERC, worked with the electricity ISAC for 5 or 6 years before moving over at Dragos. I've been at Dragos since the early days, and the team that I have and some of the background on like what I'll be speaking to and how it's relevant here is on both the services as well as the R&D side. So services, and what that means for me is largely our flyaway teams of responding to intrusions that we have out there in the community, as well as a wide range of other services, whether it's penetration testing or doing vulnerability assessments or doing tabletop exercises or being part of the neighborhood watch program that we recently set up. All of that is considered services and is some of the what I'll be speaking to momentarily. But also on the R&D side, what that speaks to is as we go through the presentation, you'll see a lot of content that is put into what we call knowledge packs, and we'll dive into that a little bit. But the R&D team is largely feeding into those content packs in the form of being able to better characterize customer environments, being able to do analytics around threat behaviors that we'll get into as well. That's all being delivered from the R&D team. So next slide, John.
Yeah.
So you can go to the next one as well. We wanted to talk a little bit about just what my team's been seeing out there in the world. A lot of the anecdotes that we have or metrics that we've been able to establish are in year in review reports. So if you're not familiar with the ICS year in review reports, they are a series of documents that we release and publish. I think we did it in February of this year. We've been going on 3 years now. So this is certainly a annual thing that we do. And each year we release several of them. This last year, we released 3. Some of that's coming from our intelligence side. So we have a year in review that's focused entirely on activity groups that we're seeing out in the wild, threat actors that are either have capabilities or intent around industrial control systems. We also have a awesome vulnerability assessment that we do. So part of our intelligence feed and service offering is understanding new vulnerabilities, how they may be applicable to customer environments and what the real impact is. And so a consolidation of those findings is in that report. The report I'll be speaking to today is, I believe it's titled First Lines, or Front Lines of ICS Security. So this is essentially what my team has been seeing out there in the wild over the course of the year. You can see some stats there. As I was reviewing it earlier this morning, I would say how this applies to what we were speaking to today, and some of the challenges of just customer environments is visibility into the environment. And that's in the context of if you're responding to an incident that largely that's already occurred. So you need to have already started collecting information in order to do that forensics, in order to do that root cause analysis. And that's a large missing piece. So one of the numbers that's not on the slide, but I have in front of me is 0% of the IR cases we worked on last year had aggregated logging or passive visibility into the ICS networks. What that means is largely that all of our incident response was manual. So forensics is really challenging. It's always slower than you think it is. And that's doubly so when you have to manually collect each piece of evidence from individual hosts in order to start telling that picture. But worse, if you weren't already collecting that information, then it's going to be a challenge to even put that to identify what has already occurred. So it puts you in a not even in a reactive spot, in a spot that becomes challenging in order to understand root cause and be able to piece together that story. Largely, the forensics and doing the investigation is telling the story of what occurred and doing it in a cohesive fashion. If you have large blocks of time, if you have logs that stopped, that rolled over and are no longer covering that length of time that you need, then you have a gap in your story, and that's not a good thing at the end of the day. I saw a question pop up as I was talking on where some of these stats are. The year in review report, all 3 years actually, are available on dragos.com under resources. So you can pull up that report as well as the Intel activity group and vulnerability report all from that page. One of the recommendations that we have continually had is ICS network visibility and asset identification management. And you'll see reference to a couple different areas. So certainly we're going to be talking about the Dragos platform. And that's a codification of everything that we do. We're really proud of our technology. Every customer is on a different leg in their journey. And so this isn't a silver bullet. It's not going to solve all of your needs. The year in review report notes 2 different other white papers. They're in the footnotes of the year in review. One of them is a collection management framework. So that's essentially how you can understand your visibility in the environment and piece together a forensic story with or without technology, whether it's manually collecting a collection of host logs, and basically creating that management framework of knowing what you have available in your environment and what the data retention is there, so that you can basically act on the data when needed, whether it is running through a intelligence report and doing a sweep of behaviors within your environment manually, or being able to rely on aggregated logs and knowing that you have 6 months of logs from all your Windows hosts. the collection management framework, which is, again, also something that's available on Dragos.com for free. It's out there. The other one is our crown jewels analysis framework, which it's a long name actually on the white paper itself. It's something along the lines of, oh, there it is, improving OT defense and response with consequence-driven ICS cybersecurity scoping. Ultimately, what it means is it posits the methodology that we use at customer environments on what is critical within a customer environment and what should be prioritized from a architecture standpoint, from a defensive standpoint. That white paper combined with the collection management framework gives you the pieces in order to create programs agnostic of technology, whether you're using the Dragos platform or you're just starting at the very beginning and understanding what is critical in your environment. Those two, and what your visibility is onto those components, those two pieces by themselves will go a long way to then allow you to start asking more questions. Next slide, John.
Yeah, Ben, I think it's important to highlight there as well that part of that program, while you're talking about doing crown jewel analysis and figuring out what is important, but also looking at and kind of basing your program around risk and understanding risk within the environment, where the potential large impacts could be if there was an event or something to take place and how that would affect operations. Those are some very key points that we'll highlight a little bit in the demo as well a little bit later on.
Yeah, absolutely. And this slide presents some information outside of Dragos. Certainly, a SANS webinar makes sense to cover some of what SANS is tracking as well. This report and this survey is done annually at the SANS ICS Summit. So the SANS ICS Summit, if you haven't been there, is an annual event hosted in Orlando the very beginning of each year. So generally February or March, I want to say, is when the event occurs. But that's where these stats are coming from. So each year, there are polls that go out to all the attendees, and these are some of the responses. Now, certainly there's a bit of a bias towards these stats in regards to these are attendees that are attending ICS Summit. So they have a certain level of understanding and dedicating resources in the fact of people's time and travel costs to get folks out to SANS. So it's a fair assumption. You can say this is some of the more forward-leaning community members out there that are attending these summits, and these are some of the results, which is good validation on what Dragos has been doing as far as keywords of visibility and getting monitoring out there and having some sort of asset identification program. This is where we are as a community within the industrial control system space. And these are some of the challenges that Dragos has been working on for the last 3 or 4 years. Next slide, John, and I think you take it from here. Oh, you're muted.
Probably help if I unmute myself here. Cool, thanks, Ben. Let's jump in and talk a bit about the scenario and some of the context and background to it. So today we're going to be looking at a town called Cyberville. Again, this is fictitious. At Dragos, we've got several ICS ranges running all sorts of different types of equipment and covering different verticals. So we've got equipment, I believe in this scenario, running from Rockwell, SEL, Emerson, Schneider, GE, and a few others, I believe, as well. Some of you might have ranges or multiple ranges set up in your environment or at your company. Some of you may not. Ranges are extremely valuable tools to use, especially when doing research, testing, doing education as part of our 5-day training class. As well as at SANS, I know there is several different types of small scale ranges to get hands-on to really understand assets, understand protocols, understand how they work together. So that's a very, very important part of a program, especially if you're doing security and want to understand and test things out before implementing things into production environments. For Cyberville in this demo specifically, we're going to be looking at an electric range. that simulates power, storage, and also has a substation. The image you guys are looking at right now, we've got the little icons spread out across here to look at. Up in the upper left-hand corner, we've got the site office, and then moving from the upper left to the right, we've got a battery storage network, solar, wind, gas turbine, a combined cycle, and then down in the lower left-hand corner is a substation. So that's what's comprising of this particular microgrid. The purpose of the facility, just to give some background, does have energy storage. It's also considered a peaker facility. So in peak demand times, the facility can kick on, start generating power that can help support the Cyberville town, as well as it can support black starts, or a black start. So there's a 240 kV transmission substation, 10 megawatt battery storage, and a 44 megawatt combined cycle gas turbine running here. Let's see, in the event of a blackout, this particular center can help support the town. Let's see, yeah, I think I covered the basics here. So we're going to move on and talk a little bit about the actual network behind these different ranges. Specifically in this scenario, we're going to focus on the battery network, which is this .10 range. There's also the balance of plant, which is the gas, the combined cycle gas turbine. That's going to be the .20. We've included the .30, the substation, although that's mainly just to highlight that it's an isolated network and there's no traffic behind it. But we'll look at that as we dive into the actual demo and take a look at how this facility is architected and set up, and what getting asset visibility really looks like from a product, specifically through the Dragos platform. So we're going to start by focusing on asset visibility. A lot of common questions that we hear when talking to the community or talking to prospects. Folks want to know what's on their network. Some people already have solutions. Some people already have processes in place to go about determining what's in their environment, but a lot of folks don't. So really getting a holistic view of what's in your environment, what assets do you have, how those assets are networked together, how they communicate, what protocols, and effectively just looking at operations across an entire facility. Other questions we run into are, do I have misconfigurations or security gaps in the environment? It's really common to run into this scenario, especially when you believe you've got your ICS segmented off from different parts, whether it's the corporate part of your network or just other parts that you don't believe that it's connected to. A lot of times after we deploy a platform or have Ben's team go on site and do a security assessment and really assess what's going on in the environment, we run in and find rogue devices that are plugged in. Those devices sometimes actually have external connectivity. We also run into having remote connectivity already set up in an environment. A lot of times that doesn't necessarily mean that it's malicious or bad. A lot of times it's intended. And specifically around cases where you have integrators or OEMs that need remote access into a facility to help manage and support it. And then also understanding what changes take place in the environment. And it's very important to highlight the word when in that case. For us in the technology and how we believe asset visibility is very important, has to do with time. So not just having a static view of what's in your environment at a given point in time or at the current time you're looking at, but really being able to go back and look and see, what did this asset look like a day ago, an hour ago, a week ago, or a month ago? And how can I relate that to different detections or notifications that are firing in the environment? So time is a very important aspect, and we'll highlight that here in a bit, as well as what's happening inside of control protocols. So it is very important in the solution you have or the solution you're looking for to make sure that that solution does provide some deep packet inspection. It can look at, pick out application layer protocol information, and provide that extra context to the assets that you have in your environment. We're going to kind of talk a bit about this, and I'm going to step into the next slide here, and we're going to shift over and take a look at what this means in the Dragos platform, but specifically for the Cyberville network. Ben, anything you want to add before I step over?
No, man, I think you did great.
Cool. All right, so right now we are looking at Cyberville. Again, the highlights, we've got various parts of the network that we have zoned out. So within the Dragos platform, one of the very important parts for us is being able to do zoning, but being able to do zoning across an entire deployment, not just within an isolated area of a network. So for us, we deploy network sensors all over, whether it's in one plant, multiple plants, various tap points throughout the environment. And then from there, we can go ahead and zone based off of whether it's IP space, types of assets, the types of vendors that you have. There's a very rich way to go about doing zoning. In this particular case, though, we've got them zoned out based on the actual plants, as well as I want to highlight down here this historian zone. So we talked a little bit about crown jewel analysis and having a risk-based program where if you can identify assets within your environment that could potentially have big impact, if they were to be compromised, or if an attacker was to gain control, or even if there was just to be misconfigurations and things were to go offline, being able to isolate those assets and highlight them is extremely important. So for us in this case, we've zoned everything out based on the actual plants and the networks, but we've also highlighted this historian zone down here, which is a main historian. When I click on it, you're going to see that this one particular historian has connections into a lot of other places within the network at this energy facility. Oops, sorry, as I zoom out here. So I know that this is a very important asset to me. If this was to get compromised, there's potential ways that an actor could pivot all throughout the environment. So that's important to know. Another thing to highlight over on the left-hand side is if you do have external communications, or you do have communications within your environment that's reaching out to the internet. In this case, maybe it's communications you know about. So if you have an external vendor like an OEM or an integrator that performs operations or updates or does maintenance in your environment, being able to highlight those, and zone those into one place to keep track of them over time is important. Especially from this view, I can get a very quick overview of what within my network is actually reaching out here. And likewise, we have this internet zone set up, which is kind of a catch-all for any kind of traffic that's hitting IP addresses or endpoints that are not considered within my network. I'm able to visualize those and have a quick queue into, if I click on this zone here, I can have a quick visual cue of, is there anything within my network talking to these endpoints? And then if I needed to, I could zoom in. I've already gone through and labeled some of these just to help tell the story a little bit better. But in this case, I get a little bit more information about them, the country of origin. So we've geolocated these IP addresses because they are publicly routable. We've got some information about the protocols that were being spoken between these two assets. So I can dive in just from this visual view and take a look at what's going on. And then likewise, it's also important to be able to get different perspectives in different views of assets, not just by zoning like we're showing here, but being able to catalog and kind of characterize what's in your environment. So up in the upper right-hand corner, we have the ability to come through here and group assets by a bunch of different ways. So in this case, I want to see what different types of assets do I have in my environment, not just how they're zoned. But I've got a nice, easy way to drill down here and say, I've got what looks like about 10 different PLCs in my environment. I've got some VMs, some enterprise management servers down here, some Windows servers, some controllers. So again, it's a quick, easy way to kind of dive in. If I'm very new to doing asset inventory and asset visibility, being able to use a tool like this or other tools to help visualize what's in your environment, to start asking questions and maybe start building that risk profile of what assets in my environment look like. They're either very important, what assets don't I know about? are there rogue assets that stick out that would take me a very long time to just sift through logs to be able to figure out. In this case, you can do it visually. But then also having a different perspective or a different view where we're not so much exploring and discovering what's there, but in this case, having more of a statically defined view of the network and how things are laid out. You can start to utilize capabilities like timeline analysis. So in this case, there's my alarms go off here. In this case, I'm gonna use the timeline down at the bottom here, zoom back to 10 o'clock, and then walk through and get a view of, I'll just click play, and get a view of what's happening in the environment, what assets are communicating, and how that communication changes over time. So if you've got if you have a solution, or if you're using the Dragos platform, being able to get a good sense of what operations typically look like over time and build that picture out. Again, you've got another visual way that you can dive in and understand what's happening in the environment here. This is very helpful to point out in the case of having a rogue asset or a rogue device show up in the environment. I'm going to zoom into the combined cycle network up here. And we're going to notice this laptop sitting down here, which is something new and is something that was brought into this demo scenario where we had a contractor come on site, plug into the network, and start interfacing with this GE Simplicity turbine, the G Simplicity HMI. So if I wanted to get a view of at what point in time was this asset communicating, and then what was this asset communicating, I can start to drill in and kind of move through the timeline to get a point of, okay, it looks like it came online around 12:30, went offline between 12:45, 1 o'clock, came back online around 1, and then disappeared after that. So in this case, again, it's a quick way to kind of drill down and have a visual view and perspective as to what's going on. If I want to dive into details to see more information about assets running in the environment, you can do so by kind of highlighting them, but something I want to point out here, which is we talk about deep packet inspection and the importance of protocol analysis and really understanding assets. In this case, we have our PLC in the gas turbine network. We start breaking out things like the SIP name or the actual IO card names, the vendor, the model, the serial number of a device, just based on the protocols that we're seeing in the environment. And this is very important information to have, especially when you start getting into things like passive vulnerability analysis and just understanding contextually what's happening in the environment. But looking for this in a solution or using this in the platform, you're able to get that information just by listening passively on the wire. So picking out protocols, dissecting those protocols. In this case, we're looking at SIP. We've got some information about the source and desk ports down here, as well as some additional context around how an asset gets characterized. So again, building the importance around understanding the types of assets you have and starting to look at that risk profile and the different types of impacts that could happen if there was an event or if something was to take place against a specific asset. Cool. So from there, we're actually going to hop back over to, let me switch back over here. So that's talking about asset visibility, kind of an architecture overview of what's in the environment. The second part of the demo, we're going to switch over and talk a bit more about threat detection. So in this case, we're going to be using the same range, the same scenario setup. That's the combined cycle plant. What we found is that most companies looking for asset visibility tools or products to try to understand their network and what's happening within their environment. After they get that visibility and really start building confidence into understanding what's in their network, from there, it's kind of jumping into the what's next. Like I now have a good grasp on my environment. I have confidence that I can know if things are changing. I can know when new assets come online or if things go offline, but now I want to understand threats and how to go about detecting those threats in my environment. We also commonly hear, how do I focus on the right things and not get lost in the noise? So for products out there that are either focused on or based around anomalies, where we generate tons and tons and tons of events, it's very easy to get lost in the noise. So it's important to go about finding ways to drill down into the things that are important and that are relevant. And then also having context available when detections occur or when notifications are provided to the analysts to really be able to drill down and focus. Let's see, Ben, anything you want to add for the detection piece here?
The one thing that stood out in the back of my head as you're walking through the Asset Explorer in the demo, it reminded me of a case that we did a while ago. That was actually it was malware that had been within the environment and measured in years, and it had beaconing activity. It was trying to get to the internet, and then that traffic never made it to the internet. It was being dropped by the firewall. Regardless, it was on the individual hosts. I forget the number of hosts that it was on. Largely from just John talked a lot about the asset component piece, but we really focus in a lot on zone-to-zone communications when we're using the technology, and it's something that we can't get when we're showing up during a response. It's getting access to the understanding the environment, the architecture, getting access to the right switch, and configuring the span ports because they largely don't exist. And then you start getting insight into what's going on the communications aspects. That goes back to that point on doing manual collection. It's only from starting now into the future. If they had something along these lines, they would have had months sorts of records of just activity that's occurring on the network, largely through zone-to-zone traffic, that can start asking, even if it's not a behavior of beaconing activity, it's still DNS requests that are odd and get bubbled up into the platform in a meaningful way. So that was the anecdote I had while you were talking through this.
Thanks. So we're gonna walk through the second half of the scenario here. Talk a bit about detection, like and I want to touch base on the 4 different types of detection. So in the case of the demo, you're going to see our detection dashboard, which focuses on configuration, modeling, indicators, and threat behaviors. So in the case of detections and kind of how things get characterized, it's very easy to get overwhelmed by certain types of detections. So modeling, configuration-based events typically focus around either things that change based on statistical analysis, or just types of actual configurations, or the way the environment is set up. So if you have a lot of if you kind of scoped out your environment, you have a lot of detections that may end up firing around things like PLC starts and stops. All of these types of events help give additional context and kind of serve as building blocks, as well as indicators. So an indicator type of detection is what you would traditionally see with either it's an IP address that's known to be associated with a specific campaign, or if it's file signatures or hashes. Those types of things, again, end up becoming building blocks into what we focus at Dragos, which is threat behaviors. And to talk through threat behaviors, we're actually gonna use the MITRE ATT&CK for ICS matrix. This is a common lexicon on how you could talk about tactics and techniques across adversaries and adversary tradecraft. It's also really useful when you're planning out scenarios, especially the one we're going to go through today. We're going to highlight a couple different areas throughout the attack matrix. These are things that our professional services team, Ben's team, has been using for things like red teaming, also doing incident response planning. So it can serve a lot of different purposes. But in the case of this demo, we're going to look at a couple different areas. So for the scenario, we took elements from behaviors of Allanite, as well as Xenotime. Allanite is an activity group that targets the electric utilities, or has targeted electric utilities in the past. And Xenotime is a group that's previously targeted petrochemical facilities. You may be familiar with the Trisis attack that happened. as well as we're going to look at a couple different events and kind of specifically highlight some of these as we walk through our demo here in a minute. To make this a little bit more tangible though, in the case, we're going to go back to the range that we originally used. We're going to start by looking at the direct access from the cellular modem on the outside of the network, look at some of the legitimate traffic that took place, as well as some unknown traffic that we highlighted earlier out to that internet zone. After that, an adversary kind of gains access to the modem, pivots down into the environment, does some fuzzing and discovery of what's in the battery network, then pivots to that historian that we talked about, that crown jewel kind of in our network that has a bunch of different access and is kind of considered as a pivot point or a central pivot point of the network. And then from there, they gained access into the GE Simplicity HMI and the engineering workstation over in the combined cycle plant, which ultimately led to issuing a first stop command of the PLC in that plant. So with that being said, I'm gonna pivot back over here and we're gonna switch sides. So a quick thing to highlight real fast, in our UI, we actually have this concept of a left and right side of the drag bar here. It's specifically meant to deal with use cases where you're trying to do multiple things at once, whether it's looking at a detection and trying to gain more information about that detection, or pivoting through and looking through cases and playbooks, which we'll talk about in a second. But I just like to highlight that because sometimes it can be, it can stand out because it's a little different than a lot of UIs that you may be familiar with already. In this case, we're looking at the detection dashboard, which highlights what we just talked about with the 4 different types of detections, kind of categorize the notifications that fire within the platform, but groups them based on the type. In this case, we're looking at this as a summary view. So we have things that roll up into the actual detection that fired, not the individual events. But in this case, looking over at threat behaviors, we've got a single port scan that fired, a sequential scan, an RDP or a couple RDP port mismatch events that took place. Whether all those events are the same, they're likely different occurrences, but also potentially different types of events broken down there. So that's one way we help to offer kind of drill down or kind of filter out some of the noise of tons of individual events that may take place. But in this case, I'm going to switch over to the individual view and just look at the notifications that fired. Specifically, I'm going to filter down or filter out some of the low level severities. So within the platform, we scale, or we have our severity scale based on 0 to 5. Typically, our zeros are more of the silent, very event-driven pieces, or things that are event-driven within the environment. That are, again, used as building blocks to build out larger contexts of composite events that are taking place. So we're going to filter out the 0s through 2, and we're just going to look at some of the higher severity events. Specifically, my eye kind of gets drilled down into this configuration quad, which is looking at a forced stop event that took place. So I'm able to filter down on that very quickly, as well as up here, we have an HMI discovery detection and a couple of strange RDP looking events that took place as well. So from here, just by clicking on the event, we get some additional context. We can drill in to see what assets were involved in that event. So instead of having to, instead of getting a notification or looking in a SIM and getting details that way, and then having to go kind of run down what assets were involved, whether it's the IP address or the host name of the asset, in this case, draw in that context immediately to here are the assets that were involved in this. And by clicking on that, I can drill in to get additional details about it right on the spot, or just go back to the notification and kind of move from here to start triaging what took place in the environment. I did just mention SIMs, and I think I saw a question about it as well that we can touch at the very end here, but it is a pretty common use case to see different solutions in this space where a lot of security operations already probably have a SIM as part of their toolkit. And it's common practice to have notifications get generated, and those notifications populate a SIM that helps kind of correlate data from all sorts of places throughout the environment, whether it's the OT side or the OT and the IT side. So that's definitely a very common use case and one that we see and some of our customers use today. But It's also important to have that additional context for the events when they do take place. So if we move over and look at this HMI discovery detected, I've got a related notification. So again, this is one of the building blocks that kind of fed into this behavior, where in this case, I've got a scan that happened, and then after that, an admin access event to an HMI. So I'm kind of building that behavior of, I had a device on my network, it scanned, it did some form of scan, in this case, a sequential ARP scan of a particular IP block, which is that combined cycle. And then immediately after that, that device accessed the admin interface for one of the HMIs. So I've got that additional context immediately with me here, but we can also drill down and you also get the other relevant context around this particular detection, which is we've seen this detection before associated to Xenotime. Doesn't necessarily mean it is Xenotime. It's more so that it's tradecraft that activity group has used in the past. So it helps provide a little bit more relevant context. As well, again, kind of mapping this back to the MITRE ATT&CK for ICS framework, where we've got a couple different steps within the framework that apply to this particular detection or apply to the underlying events making up this detection. And then down below, which we'll talk here in a second, one of our key value adds kind of from our platform and where the codification of our expertise at Dragos kind of comes into play for Ben's team is being able to take those lessons learned and being able to kind of codify those in the form of playbooks to help instruct people that in the event of a detection takes place, how does your team or how should the analyst go about effectively taking next steps? What kinds of actions can someone take after a detection happens and they see it in the platform? Or if you have it in a SIM, what are the next kind of steps that you would do to go find out whether or prove out whether it's a false positive or discover if there's any other related information around it that would help provide context to either move forward in your triage or if you're doing an incident response, being able to tie that information together. So with that, if we wanted to here, we could create a case and kind of pivot over. Just for the sake of time, we already have one set up. And specifically, this is looking at the scenario here for the loss of control or loss of visibility within the combined cycle plant. We've got a couple of the notifications already attached here. So it's things that we saw that we think are relevant to this particular incident. We've attached a few pieces of evidence, in this case, some log snippets of the actual SIP communication that fired the force stop command. But more importantly, what I want to highlight is the importance around having a playbook and kind of posturing your team or setting your team up for being able to operate in the event of something happening or being able to kind of take the next steps of, let's say in this case, we have a playbook attached based on that force stop command that we saw. And then from here, we've got a whole bunch of additional relevant context to what the SIP protocol is, why should you care about it, what other information can you go find, whether it's either in the platform or if you go back to that collection management framework that Ben was talking about, if you have various data points that you're already collecting in your environment, where could you go be able to discover that? And these kind of things are customizable. So you could come in here if you have a different area that you are collecting logs and storing logs, being able to alter these and say, instead of pivoting over to the platform, go over to your SIM and look for this type of data, which is possible here. So in this case, I was going to highlight, as we step through this playbook, specifically kind of looking down into the actual protocol and some of the data that we're pulling out. We have a concept within the platform called query focused data sets. And that's our effort to go ahead and help pull data together to help answer questions. It kind of speaks to the name there, but it's effectively, of all the data that we collect within the platform, how can we go about putting those into data sets that will help easily answer questions? So in this case, I'm going to expand this out so we can see both sides here. In this case, I'm looking through at the various SIP identities that we're pulling out of SIP protocol traffic, specifically for this PLC. And we're able to dive into, and here's where we're driving this, here's where we're deriving the serial numbers. some of the product codes, the SIP names, all related back to that device, whether it's the IO cards on that device or the chassis itself. All right, Ben, is there anything you want to add on to this particular part around playbooks?
Yeah, so my team's both the users and authors of the playbooks. Also, the neighborhood watch team uses the playbooks and as well as contributes to them. The response team contributes to them quite heavily. Really, at the very early stages when we started developing playbooks, it came down to, okay, so what problem are we trying to solve? And that led to lots of discussions. But ultimately, where we landed is, if there's a notification within the system, there's that window of time where an analyst is trying to triage what's occurred. What are the likely false positives? What is the point where there should be escalation? And what does this actually mean? If it's a analyst that has not a lot of understanding of what SIP is, they may not know what SIP identities are, and being able to describe and put that in context to the notification, those are largely what we're articulating within those playbooks. Which feeds into knowledge packs.
Perfect, thanks. Yeah, and to wrap some of this up, so we, as Ben was talking about knowledge packs, there are a couple different areas that we try to tie together the threat intelligence, the experience of our threat operations center, as well as our technology, which kind of comes together in the form of a knowledge pack. These are things we put out on a monthly basis. You can import them into the platform, and it effectively adds or continuously adds new protocols that we dissect, different types of detections and analytics that get deployed. So as our Intel team continues to learn more about adversaries and activity groups, and what they're doing in the world or in different environments, we're able to kind of codify those and push those out to our customers. These are important things, but if you're looking at this not just from a Dragos platform perspective, but being able to continually gain insights into what's happening, staying relevant into different types of behaviors, tactics, techniques that are being used in the real world, and applying those to your security program internally is a very important concept here. And then to kind of tie all this together, just to kind of briefly look at some of the benefits of using the platform. Some of these can apply to things outside of the platform itself, but being able to have that expert insight be codified in technology to really help be a force multiplier in your environment. Adding additional visibility, additional context around protocol information in operations and what's happening in the environment. As well as gleaning those insights from our threat operations team and our Intel team at Dragos. And with that, we move to the end. I see there's quite a few questions over here. I'm gonna start looking through. I haven't had a chance to dive into these too much yet, Ben. If you've got one off the top of your head that you want to dive into, let's go ahead and start there. Let's see here. So we've got how many days can data be stored, logging of traffic? That's a great question. So with any solution in this space, obviously you're going to run into storage challenges, especially depending on the size of a deployment. Whether you have a collection strategy already set up and you're using various open source tools, or if you're using the Dragos platform, the amount of data you can store is kind of based on the hardware and some of the resource limitations there. For us, we have some very large customers that are storing data up to 90 days to, I think we've got some that are up to about 6 months or a little bit more. So it's kind of dependent. Most of the data that gets stored is usually contextual information around communications between assets, as well as asset data themselves. So for us, our asset data doesn't roll off as quickly as other types of information, whether it's various logs that we collect. So that's a great question. Let's see, is there an immediate alert generated if the laptop is connected to the network? Yeah, so in this case, we've got a couple different ways to go about seeing whether or not new devices exist. One of those things are we have notifications that do fire as new communication happens in the environment, as new addresses come online, or address associations may change within your environment, depending on whether you have a statically defined network or if you're using DHCP or something like that. Being able to track those and have those notifications that you can pivot off of, those typically fall into the configuration category. So in that case of that laptop that we saw, there were some new communication notifications that did fire. So yes, that's a good question there. Let's see.
Well, one of the first questions, John, that was asked, I think we have a good answer for that. But to what extent are you seeing customers exporting the asset data into other tools?
Yeah, good question there. So it actually happens quite often. So if you already have a CMDB in your environment, or you've got a formal way or process that you're collecting asset information and wanting to store those, having that ability to export data out of the platform is definitely possible now. You can go in and export and create a full kind of asset report that's got all the different attributes that we add to assets, whether it's the location of them or the type of asset or the SIP information that we showed here for that Rockwell PLC. All that stuff can be exported and kind of loaded into a different tool. We've also got some integrations currently set up and that are being released very, very soon. One is with ServiceNow and their CMDB integration. The other one's with Splunk, being able to share asset data over to that SIM. In that case, being able to feed notification information and asset data kind of helps you be able to do and draw value out of this particular solution, but any other solution within a SIM. So that's a great question. Similar to, you'll see the next one in the list, similar in the example of the rogue device connection. Are there customers integrating SIMs to manage events? Yeah, so I'd say quite a bit of our customer base and quite a bit of the community that we've talked to has a SIM, whether it is Splunk or QRadar. Those are two of the common ones we typically run into. A lot of folks are aggregating data and events into their SIM, so it is pretty common that we see that. And it is a good workflow. It certainly will help, especially if you have a large amount of notifications or alerts in your environment. And you want to be able to start and triage that way and help draw some context outside of some of the data points that you may be collecting or seeing in the platform. But where the value really adds, or the value comes in, is being able to pivot back into, in this case, the Dragos platform, and get the additional context about the assets or any of the other communications surrounding that event, and being able to visualize it. Or in the case of having, if you're using the case management system to do triaging, being able to start and do that triaging within the tool and sharing it with the rest of your team as you continue to work through that. And then potentially in the future, exporting that if you have a full-blown case management system. The platform isn't meant to be a full-blown case management system. Our goal with that piece is to provide some of the foundation to do triage, to be able to do a response and aggregate data into one place and not have to pivot all over the place, but being able to take advantage of that in our APIs and export that information into a full-blown case management suite is totally possible. And we have had customers do that in the past.
I have one question that I can answer for you as well. I know we have about 6 minutes left, so this maybe one more question after this, depending on how fast I can answer it. But one of the questions was regarding span port traffic and just driving the cost of having to have a span port on every switch and being able to deal with that complexity. Basically, the costs associated in a very large environment. There's a couple options there. So certainly, It's identifying the where your crown jewels are essentially. So what we would recommend is getting north to south traffic between the zones, the trust levels, and then areas of heightened concern, critical functions such as like turbine control, for instance. That's where you would want to get the east-west traffic of knowing what's happening within that network itself. We also have additional data that we can absorb that we didn't fully touch on here. But if there are host collection mechanisms or other data feeds that exist in your environment, you can forward those over into Dragos and we can ingest those. So it's not only a question of span port, yes or no. There's a lot of other data feeds that we can ingest and do correlations on as well, which gives a lot of flexibility for folks in either early deployment or after the fact. Did you have?
I've got another question I want to, another question that kind of plays off of that I want to address, which is, are there any minimum requirements to be able to do this type or have this type of tool, or in that case, kind of any tool within the environment that's monitoring network traffic? And the question specifically is asking about managed switches within the network. So it's not a requirement to have managed infrastructure to be able to do this type of work, but it makes it significantly easier if you do have the right infrastructure in place to be able to tap or listen or have span ports or mirrored ports on switches throughout your environment, or at least within some key places, whether it's some of the backbone or kind of what Ben just highlighted on being able to look at that east-west traffic versus having the north-south traffic when it's either in between your, whether it's egress out of your network entirely, but being able to look internal to the network is very, very important. And if you don't have managed infrastructure to be able to support that, you can do things like inline taps, which again, it's feasible, but it introduces a lot of complexities and challenges, especially when you're trying to get a complete picture as to what's going on in the environment. I hope that helps out. But outside of that, no, there's not really a minimum requirement outside of having an Ethernet network. So there was a question early on about, does the product work on serial links or serial communication? And our product is IP based. So it does sit and listen to network traffic on an Ethernet network. It does not monitor the serial communications, which is kind of a different use case and scenario altogether. We've only got a minute left, so I'm not going to dive into that specifically here, but that is a great question to ask, especially getting involved or starting to look at your security posture and what tools and solutions you have in your space. Understanding that this is capable even if you don't have that managed infrastructure. All right, so we're at the top of the hour. I'm gonna turn it back over to Jessica.
Great, thank you, John. That's all the time that we do have for today. Thank you to our speakers, John and Ben, for that great presentation, and to Dragos for sponsoring this webcast, which helps brings this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcast. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.